Hi, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here at the Craft Conference. Let me just introduce myself a little bit. I'm a technical Agile coach with Pragma, and I speak at conferences, and I wrote this book a few years ago about coding dojos, how to learn test-driven development, and I spoke at Craft a few years ago on that topic. I'm based in Sweden, but I grew up in the UK. Do get in touch with me on Twitter or email. So this is a talk about technical leadership, and that naturally brings us to a discussion of architects and architecture. So I wanted to start with a slide showing a beautiful building, a beautiful piece of architecture. This is a church in Barcelona, and it was the architect of this incredible piece of architecture is Gaudi, who's very famous. They started building this building in 1883. And Gaudi was the original designer and architect on the project, and they're still building it. And he died in 1926. So this is perhaps why I'm not so convinced that architect and architecture is the best metaphor for what we do in software. I don't think that in software you can do all the architecture work and then leave or die, and then they're still building the thing like 100 years later. That's not kind of how it works in software. So I'm pretty skeptical to this whole architecture analogy in the first place. But then I also wanted to tell you a little about my experience. When I was a young software developer, quite new to the industry, 15, 20 years ago, architects in my organization, they were these distant figures who they were somewhere in their ivory towers, coming up with beautiful documents about what I should be doing. And it just felt really quite irrelevant. I think these people had the best of intentions, and probably they were very competent, but they no longer wrote any code, and they just didn't feel relevant to me. Today, I think we live in a very different kind of landscape, and I hope that everyone is working with more modern methods and has more help from their technical leaders. Because that's what I think architects basically are. They're leaders with very technical advice to give. And the whole purpose of the leadership is to help everyone, all the developers, to make better choices in their daily work. And that's what the kind of technical leader I aspire to be today, now that I'm in that senior position. I want to be the kind of person who's helping everyone to make better decisions. So that's a theme I'm coming back to. But these days, of course, we're all working in agile organizations. And I like to tell this story to illustrate what I mean. I think this illustrates agility really well. So this is a tweet exchange that happened a few years ago. The first tweet is the owner of a Tesla car, and he's complaining and saying, look, when I want to charge my car, the spot for charging is always full of people who've just parked there, even if their car is already charged. So very surprisingly, the head of Tesla, Elon Musk, actually responds to this tweet and says, yeah, this is a problem. I agree, we should do something about this. And that in itself is surprising enough, that customers are getting direct contact with the company, and even the higher levels of the company. But then, what really I like about this story is it was just 6 days later, 6 days after this tweet exchange, Tesla rolled out an update to all of their cars, so that if you were standing at a parking spot and your car was fully charged at a charging spot, you would be charged an idle fee of 40 cents a minute, which is enough money that it was cheaper to move the car to an actual parking spot. And of course, this solved the problem. People were no longer filling up all the charging spots. So I like this story because it illustrates some really important aspects of agility, being able to understand your customers, your users, that the company is taking notes and able to respond with a change in their software in a matter of days, a timely update. And that's what we want for Agile. We want to be able to respond to what our customers need in a timely way. So these days, we're all working in these agile teams trying to achieve this agility, which is great. And I've just got some quotes here about Scrum and extreme programming and SAFe, and I think they all say basically the same thing, that in Agile you have self-organizing and cross-functional teams, and all the necessary skills are present in that team to deliver the software that those customers are going to be delighted by. So this, originally, Agile teams were quite independent, and you would have an organization of one Scrum team or one XP team that would deliver the product. The organizations I work with today more typically have a lot of Agile teams, and they're typically collaborating on the same product or the same product landscape. And we divide them up into different value streams, or perhaps some team is looking after a particular back-end service or a particular piece of infrastructure. But these days, we have a lot of teams, basically. And they're all supposed to be cross-functional and self-organized. And this is great. But what I'm seeing in the future is that these teams are going to be even more strong, even empowered. And I get that from this book. Now, this book has come up a couple of times at this conference already, so I'm hoping some of you will have read it. It's a book about the science of DevOps, and one of the authors is Jez Humble, who is here, and he gave a talk yesterday. And what I really think is significant about this book is it's about his research that he's done with Nicole Forsgren, and they have done over several years. They've surveyed thousands and thousands of people, and they've constructed scientifically relevant hypotheses and done proper statistical analysis on them, and they've worked out some of the practices that we as software developers do that then lead to success for the business as measured in the real world, making money, basically. So it turns out that it actually matters what we as software developers do for the success of the business we work in. That in itself, I think, is a fantastic conclusion. And then they, of course, then go into more detail about what it is that we should do that would make a difference. And one of those things is stuff like continuous delivery, trunk-based development, lots of DevOps practices. But what I really wanted to pick out in my talk today was this piece about empowered teams. So they found that organizations that have empowered teams are more successful in the marketplace. They make more money. And they characterize empowered teams quite specifically. And I'm going to go through what they mean by an empowered team. It's more than just a self-organized team. They say, well, an empowered team can make large-scale design changes to the software they're working on without detailed coordination outside of that team. They can deploy their software on demand when they want to, when they need to, and they do their own testing without waiting for some integrated test environment that they share with other people. So this all sounds fantastic as a software developer. I'm going to be in control, I'm going to be autonomous, I'm going to be able to empower, and I'm going to deliver my stuff. But then, if you look at this from the point of view of the architect or the technical leader, you're like, yeah, what could possibly go wrong here? This might have some downsides. I'm not entirely sure about this. I mean, you've got this landscape of all these teams, and you can kind of think, okay, I've got all these teams that I'm kind of technically responsible for the architecture of, and they're each going to be making large-scale design changes to their system without getting my permission. And what's going to happen in a few years is we're going to have competing standards, we're going to have data fragmentation, inconsistent user experience, we're going to have code duplication, wasted efforts, unhappy developers, and they're going to come and shout at me because they're going to say it's my fault. So this is a very different world for a technical leader than the one that I experienced 15, 20 years ago. If all these teams are really empowered, that is a challenge. And I think it's quite clear that if your teams are empowered, this architect can't be this remote figure who is dictating things and expecting stuff to happen. They really have to get off this, this ivory tower and get down to earth and start actually helping in a different way. So I think when it comes to technical leadership of a bunch of empowered DevOps teams, the leader has to behave quite differently. And the aim is still the same, of course. You want the developers to be making good choices. But the means of achieving that, I think, need to change quite a lot. I think, basically, the leaders cannot be slowing down the teams. You can't put barriers in their way. That's kind of what the empowered team thing is about. You have to be seen as help, not a hindrance. So you can end up, what you need to do then is turn into the good person who is giving gifts. The architect is there giving timely, relevant advice when the teams need that advice, kind of on demand. And the teams want to follow this advice because they trust the leader knows what they're talking about, they have respect for them, and they appreciate the experience that they're bringing. They can give gifts of convenient libraries and convenient, useful deployment tools and all sorts of other pieces of software and infrastructure that is going to help those teams. And I think this is just basically a mindset change. The architects were doing this kind of thing before, but now they have to realize that what they're doing is giving gifts, and gifts sometimes are rejected. So this is a different mindset for the technical leaders, but I think it's more productive for everyone. So I wanted to talk about my own experience when I worked in an organization for several years where I was in a team and we were the most experienced developers in the organization. And we were there to support all the other development teams. The other teams were responsible for delivering features, building stuff. We were responsible for making their life easier and making it easier for them to deliver features. And my major piece of work over those years was a test automation framework that I was very proud of, and I think was helpful for them. And it meant that the development teams knew the best way to write their tests for whole features that would impact several microservices. So this was good. But looking back on it, I was working alone most of the time, and I think that was the big mistake that I made at that time. I should have spent a lot more time with the developers, understanding what they needed in their test framework, and training them to use it. So that's something that I learned. But let's talk a little bit more about agility. I mentioned before, agility is about responding to change. And I like to use an analogy for how we can affect how quickly we can respond to change. We need to be able to, when those customers ask for something, we want to be able to deliver that software in a timely manner. So the first thing that's going to affect how long it takes, if you're baking a cake, this is the analogy I'm using, baking. If you're going to bake a cake, it's going to take a certain longer if it's a complicated cake. You must have seen Bake Off. You must have cookery competitions in this country. This is what I'm talking about. You know, you've been asked to build this amazing chocolate creation with 5 layers and 4 different fillings. It's going to take you longer than if these are some brownies that you're going to take along to your football team and give them at half-time. So it does matter how complex the feature you're being asked to build is. Is it a really elaborate thing that's going to take some time to build, or is it quite a simple feature that's just adding a new button on an existing form? The next factor when you're baking a cake is how skilled is the chef. And this is what the baking competitions are measuring, of course. They want to know how skilled you are at separating eggs. Will you have to redo it all because you got some yolk in the wrong bowl and you're going to have to break another 24 eggs, you know? Or can you make the chocolates so beautifully tempered that you can create some amazing thing, or whether you're going to have to content yourselves with doing it twice and the second time it doesn't quite look right. And it's all these skills as a baker that you need, and I think as software developers it's similar. We need to know our tools and how to use them, and we need to know our programming languages and how to use them. And the best programmers I know are so good with their tools and their languages that they produce stuff so much faster, good stuff, than the less skilled developers. So I think skill plays a role in how agile you can be. And the last factor that I want to really highlight is the state of the kitchen. If you're in a cooking competition, of course, you walk into this amazing kitchen with this clean work surface and all the tools you need are exactly there, and the ingredients are on hand, and everything just is going to be set out for you. If I'm going to bake at home, sometimes it's not quite that easy. Some of the tools are buried in the back of a cupboard, and there's some piles of washing up in the corner. And it's going to take me longer to bake my cake in that environment. I've got to spend some time doing a bit of washing up, cleaning. I've got to find my tools. And that's, I think, the same with software. The environment that your software development team is working in makes a difference. So for a software developer, the environment, of course, comprises the IDE that you're using, the build tools, the debugging tools, the testing tools, the deployment tools, lots of tools. But also the existing code base, of course. Software developers spend an inordinate amount of their time reading the existing code, and it matters how clean it is. So this is basically my analogy that how quickly you can respond to change will depend on these factors, maybe not added in a linear manner, but in some kind of function of these factors. So this is what I'm really talking about with technical leadership, is how can we make that kitchen as perfect as possible for these developers to work in, and how can we help those developers to become more and more skilled so that they work more and more effectively. So agility is about infrastructure and skill for technical leaders, I would say. I want to have the kind of kitchen available to my developers where it's easy for them to make good decisions, that it's obvious what the right tool is. It's just there in the cupboard. They can take it out and they can start using it. It comes with instructions. It's easy, intuitive. They have existing code bases that are possible to work with. They know that when they come in, that's your storage, your deployment pipeline, your testing framework. If you want to use another tool, okay, you're an empowered team. You can choose another tool, but really, these ones are easiest. Take these ones first. The other thing the architects need, really, to be able to achieve this, then, is that you have to understand what the teams need and what tools to build for them and provide for them. And you need to communicate and teach them to use the skills that you want. You don't want to discover your team using a whisk that's just a fork when you provided them with an amazing machine that whisks, you know. They have to know that it's there and how to use it. So let me talk now about mob programming. Now, because I think this is really part of the solution to the situation that I've been outlining here. Mob programming, if you haven't heard about it, I'm just going to summarize. It's a structured collaboration for a group of programmers coding together all on the same machine. Woody Zuhl, one of the co-discoverers of the technique, describes it as all the brilliant people working on the same thing at the same time, in the same space, on the same computer. And that's really what it is. It's a collaboration of a group of people working together. If you've done any pair programming, then you'll know this concept of two developers working together on the same machine, and that this can be a powerful technique for collaboration and producing quality code. And it isn't actually as slow as everyone makes out that it should be when you've got two people doing the work of one. No, actually, you work better when you're two. And mob programming is basically just turning up the dials to 11 and having the whole team. For it to work, though, you need a little more structure, in my experience, than you do with pair programming. So we talk about roles in the mob. So the most obvious role is the driver. That's the person who has the keyboard, and their responsibility is to enter the code into the computer that the whole mob is using. You're going to rotate these roles relatively often, so it's important that everyone is competent with every role. The next role here I've highlighted is the navigator. The navigator is the person who is instructing the driver what code to write into the computer. So they are actually the ones who are deciding the direction of the code. The driver really is the easiest role. They just have to type whatever they're told. They can make decisions about how best to use the IDE and the shortcuts and the menus and stuff, but really that's their only concern. It's the navigator and the mob who are deciding the direction. So the members of the mob who are not currently navigating are there to assist the navigator when that's needed, or take over the navigation when that's appropriate. And their job most of the time is just to make sure they understand what's going on so that they are ready to contribute. And if the navigator needs help, they are ready to prompt them and coach them. Often, there is additionally a coach who is not really a member of the mob, who is there to actually just facilitate and make everything work more smoothly. So that's the roles. The working agreement is very important to establish that everyone in the mob is agreeing that we treat everyone in the mob with kindness, consideration, and respect. This is important for the relationships. If you get a group of software developers together in a room and ask them to write code together, it may happen sometimes that there are differing opinions about how to write that code. I think that could happen. And the thing is, when software developers have differing opinions, they might get a little bit worked up and enthusiastic about their chosen approach. So it's good to know that they've already agreed to treat everyone with kindness, consideration, and respect, even when they're right. You know? So at some point, it might happen that people can't follow this agreement, and that situation, you might ask them to leave the mob just until they can calm down enough that they can return and follow the working agreement. So this is also important in the mob. It's full of people. People and relationships are hard. But if you can get people to collaborate like this, it really does have a lot of benefits. And I'm talking from my own experience of mobbing, but also from these books, which I wanted to highlight. This first book here is by Woody Zuhl and Kevin Meadows, and this is published on LeanPub. Woody Zuhl is one of the originators of this technique, and he writes very well. This other book is actually one book. The two authors of it started the book together, and unfortunately, they didn't finish the book, and they are currently in a dispute over the copyright. So you can download the book from either of the authors at present. And it's not finished. But it's still worth reading. It's got some good stuff in. So I've got a picture here from Woody's book. This is his team that he has worked with previously. And he has included this picture in his book to show what it looks like when the mob is working effectively. You can see Woody standing at the back there. And the members of the mob are there, and one of them is using the keyboard to enter code into the computer. But there are other computers there are other keyboards, other mice. You don't have to all use the same one. The other computers can be used to research and help the mob in other ways. Then you can look at the same picture from the back, and you can see they've got a really big screen, and it's actually duplicated, so everyone has a really good view. You've got your whiteboards at the side, your team status board. You can always refer to your next task. And people, of course, when they hear about mob programming, think this must be really unproductive. We've got all of these things. We want to increase our velocity. We're having pressure. Yeah. Measuring productivity in programmers is really hard. As I think this cartoon illustrates really well, it's really hard to measure productivity because you can game the system. It's very easy to raise your velocity if you all agree to increase your estimates. So perhaps it's not so useful to look at measuring productivity as basically acknowledging what kinds of things reduce productivity. And I've just got a short list here of some of the things that you might mention if you were asked about, as a programmer, what makes you less productive? Context switching, I don't understand the requirements, the code is terrible, my best team buddy is off sick, I don't have the credentials for the test environment, I can't look in the database. You know, all these kinds of things slow you down. But if you put your whole team in the same room and get them collaborating and working together in a mob, then a lot of these kind of issues just kind of go away. And you can see that if you get rid of a lot of the sources of being less productive, that should make you more productive, right, as a team? Even if I can't prove it, this is my experience. Let's look at the benefits of mob programming. So I've noticed from my work in mob that when you're in the mob, everyone has to understand the code that you're working on. And this immediately shows itself when you bring a new person into the mob, perhaps a new team member. They very quickly learn your environment. They learn very quickly what coding standards you care about, what frameworks you're using, how you like to structure your code, how to access the QA database and run the tests and all that kind of thing. So it's a very effective way to introduce a new team member, in my experience. Another thing I've noticed about the mob is the way it acts as a skill multiplier. And by that I mean, if you have one person in the mob who knows a thing, and the mob needs to use that thing, it really doesn't take very long until everyone in the mob knows that thing. I've got this example here where one of the mob members knows about Kubernetes. And they're saying, OK, well, I'm going to navigate, and I'm going to explain. You can configure the Kubernetes pod with all this memory, and I need you to open this YAML file and write this thing. And so the whole mob is hearing that person explain in words, in real language, and then they see the driver typing that into the editor. And they have the opportunity to ask questions and say, well, why did you do that? And the experienced and skilled person can explain. And this turns out to be an excellent way of learning stuff. And soon, everyone in the mob could configure Kubernetes with this much memory for their pod. And they will hopefully learn the skills that they really need in the software that they're working on. Another thing about the mob that I've noticed is how quickly a visitor can become an asset. You can be an experienced developer who doesn't know the code base at all and has not worked with this team before, but after only a short while of mob programming with that team, you know enough to start contributing your expertise. You don't need to know everything about the framework and the language and the tools. The team knows that stuff. You can contribute with what you know that they don't know, and you can start to become an asset. And this is really interesting effect that I've experienced quite a bit, and it's really cool to come in and help a team when you don't know their code base. So I hope you can see where I'm going with this. I've just highlighted 3 major benefits of mob programming. Everyone in the mob understands the code that you wrote together. It's easy and quick to transfer skills if that skill is needed by the mob. And visitors are very quickly contributors in the mob. So how does this relate to technical leadership in a world of empowered teams? Well, I think it's absolutely relevant. You can join the mob. As the technical leader, you can join the mob of one of your teams, and you can transfer skills. You can contribute your expertise, and you can learn about the problems that that team is facing. So the coach, the technical leader, the technical coach, can encourage and assist and spend time with many teams. This thing about only needing to be there a short while before you can help. My experience is working with the same team 2 hours a day for a few weeks, and in that time really being able to contribute quite a bit, and I can work with 2, perhaps 3 teams concurrently, and then switch out to other teams. So what I'm personally coaching when I come into these teams, a lot of the time I'm teaching test-driven development. I'm helping them to follow the process, take small steps, write the test cases. Sometimes I will step into that navigator role, specifically to navigate the creation of test cases and explain why this is a good way to write that test case. I don't normally take the keyboard and drive, because the person who has the keyboard, their full focus is taken on entering the code and managing the IDE. And their expertise and design skills are lost to the mob while they're in that role. This is why it's important to rotate out of the driver role and not take it all the time, because you're not part of the discussion in the same way. So when I'm coaching a team, I will tend to either sit at the back and coach and just prompt, or I will take the navigator role. And this turns out to be a pretty effective way. It's the most effective way I've found so far of teaching TDD to a team, because you're, I back it up with some teaching, which I'll mention in a minute, but when you're in the mob, you're working in their code base, you're working on an item from their backlog, challenges that they have identified, and you can bring your full expertise to bear and show them how you would solve these problems. Of course, you also include a retrospective. That also reinforces the learning and the reflecting on what's happened. I also tend to collaborate with other coaches. Now, if you're going to be really agile, I think there's organizational changes that you need as well, and you need coaches who will help with those kinds of things. Coaches who are very technical focused, like myself, who work with the developers and the operations people. You also need coaches for the product management, perhaps setting up dual track discovery and all that stuff. And you need coaches who really understand agile methods, SAFe or Scrum or whatever. And with the combination of all these different kinds of coaches, I think the organization as a whole can become agile. So I would like, usually, when I'm coaching developers, to have a counterpart who is coaching the rest of the organization around, or several counterparts. It's a team effort. So when I talk about mob programming, people ask, well, how much of the day should we spend mob programming? Is this something that teams should be doing all day, every day? Or is it something that they just do for a while when they're with the coach? So let me answer this question. I think first you have to learn to mob program. This is a skill. It takes some time before a team of developers will be confident using this approach. And I suggest that if you have a coach 2 hours a day, 2 weeks might be enough to learn the skill. Some teams might take more, some less. My experience is that some teams, that this is kind of typical. And then after that initial period of learning the technique, where the team agrees, yes, we're going to try this for a limited period so we can learn the technique. After that, they're an empowered team. This is the kind of decision they should be able to make. And if that team decides that they want to continue mobbing full-time, I would be delighted. So far, I haven't seen that happen. What I have seen happen is that some teams will continue mobbing 2 hours a day, even when the coach is not there. I've also seen them agree to, well, we'll coach this week when we've got this new person coming in until they're up to speed. Or they'll say, oh, we'll mob while we're working on the initial stages of this new piece of architecture design that we need to do, and then we'll split up. Basically, I think once you've learned the skill of mob programming and realized some of the benefits it brings, then you're in a position to actually decide, when do we want to use this and for what purpose? So that's kind of answering how much to do it. So this thing, going back to the technical leaders, instead of these remote architects who communicate with the teams through documents and edicts, you have the coach acting as a coach. They come into the empowered teams. They can see the kitchen that the teams are working in. They can influence the decisions the team is making while they're there. And they basically, come off the pedestal and join the developers and become one of the team for a short while until they go to the next team. And as a technical leader, you can get an overview of what's going on in quite a few teams in not too long a period. And that gives you great insight into what you can do to help those teams to make better technical decisions. So I mentioned before about these 3 factors which I think are involved in being agile. And we've talked a while now about the kitchen and how you as a technical leader can contribute to a better kitchen for the developers to work in. There's also this other factor with the skill of the chef. And I think as technical leaders, we need to have a responsibility for that part too. Now, this is what my book is about. It's about how you can learn these kinds of skills. And when I wrote the book, it was about the coding dojo, and I envisaged this as a place that you would go when you wanted to learn, and you might go there once a week or once every 2 weeks and stay there a few hours. And then you would practice on code katas and so on. So since then, I've discovered that it's actually very effective if you start to introduce this kind of activity into the working day. Do it on work time with your team. And if you make it shorter and do it more often, it's even more effective. Because it turns out that learning skills is easier to do little and often. If you've ever learned a musical instrument, you'll know that the recommendation is 20 minutes a day, not 3 hours at the weekend. And it's the same, I think, with learning coding skills. It's best to do a little every day. Make it part of your routine. It's part of your normal work. We are knowledge workers. It's part of our job to stay up to speed with the latest tools and technologies, and it's part of our job to get better at what we do. And that should be part of our working day. So I'm not going to say so much more about that. That's another talk. But I do encourage you to include time for learning in your normal working day. So this is my summary slide. I've been talking about technical leadership in a world of empowered teams. And I talked about the traditional architect in this remote ivory tower, and how that just doesn't work anymore, not if your teams are empowered. I think you need to work in an entirely different way if you're working with empowered teams. So I think as technical leaders, we need to care a great deal about the environment that our developers are working in, and making those environments conducive to those developers making good decisions. And in order to understand the environment they're working in, we need to sit in the teams, coding with them. And then we might have a chance of understanding what they need and giving it to them and training them to use it. We also need to pay attention to the skills of the software developers and make sure that there is time allocated in the normal working day for learning skills. I really recommend to you the practice of mob programming and learning how to do it and working out what the benefits of it could be for your team. And then I also encourage you to see this kind of technical agile coaching that I'm describing as another kind of agile coaching, and you need to work together with the people who are coaching the organization. So you're pulling in the same direction, and the organization as a whole is going to become more agile. I also should say that coaches, technical coaches, if you've got more than one in your organization, which I hope you have, they need to collaborate together as well and to be pulling in the same direction, have time to talk. So that's a summary of what I wanted to say today. I think there are some questions. Okay. Do you need to stand by me so you can use my mic? No? Is it? No?
Oops.
It's definitely on?
That's, oh, yes.
Oh, there we are. Now it's on.
Yay.
Okay.
Hi. So let's go through some questions. We actually have some.
Okay.
So How does mob programming work with remote members?
Yeah, I knew I'd get this question. I should have mentioned it. So I don't have very much experience myself of working with remote members. I refer you to Woody's book. I haven't done it myself, but I know that it can work.
All right, cool. About mob programming again, as team working in a service company, how do you explain value to your client that for this feature we are all going to work on the same things?
Oh, right, so convincing managers that they should let you mob program?
Yeah.
So you're an empowered team. Why do you need your manager's permission for this?
Just say, we are working on this, full stop.
I mean, they trust you. They've hired you as the experts. Why did they get to also dictate how you work together and collaborate? If necessary, just say, oh, we're having a meeting. Meetings are good, right?
Some people might get stubborn, I guess. 6 people working on the same task sounds like a project manager's nightmare. How do you convince your business stakeholders that it's actually worth it? I guess the same.
It's the same question, but 6 people working on the same task means that you have single piece flow. You are working on one thing. There is no merging, there's no handovers. Talk to your project manager about lean and tell them you're doing single piece flow and they'll be impressed and maybe they'll let you carry on.
Okay. Is it a good idea to empower a team which does not have a proper skill set?
Well, this is the nightmare, isn't it? This is why I said this could easily degenerate into a terrible idea. So this is where the technical leaders need to make sure that there's support in place to try and prevent those kind of catastrophes, and that there is an architecture in place that can cope with a team delivering a service that totally fails, that there is automated rollbacks and there is infrastructure to help with that kind of thing.
Great. How to approach team members when they are underperforming and it is affecting the rest of the team? How can we inspire or help them to perform better?
Oh, that's hard. And you have a team member who you feel isn't pulling their weight. Well, I mean, as I said, the mob is a great forum for learning stuff and transferring skills. And ideally, that person will, by taking part in the mob and the learning hours, they will become more productive and a better team member. That would be the hope, that you would help them to become a better programmer.
All right. Mob programming sounds very inefficient. Are there any studies which compare mob programming versus pair programming versus single development?
I'm not aware of any such studies. There are studies on pair programming, and they've generally shown that pair programming is not as inefficient as all that. And I would like to hope that you could extend those results to mob programming, but I don't think those studies have been done yet.
Try it out, you will see. In the last night's mob exercise, thanks for the kata Emily, the navigator decided what to do. How to handle discussion or disagreement. Is it better to have a whiteboard near and discuss when the mob disagrees?
Yes, having a whiteboard nearby is an excellent idea for your mob. You should definitely do that. And when I'm working with a mob and there's disagreement and we pause the mob rotations and we will have a discussion and go to the whiteboard, and after a while hopefully either a consensus emerges or a couple of ideas emerge as front runners, and then we will try both ideas in sequence, and then the whole mob, having tried both ideas in a time box, will then be able to choose one to proceed with. So there are mechanisms in the mob to resolve these kinds of conflicts.
Whiteboard is beneficial for just about anything, no? What's the ideal mob size?
The size of your team.
It depends. Do you have any recommendation for too much autonomy? How to align teams or not to build opposing things?
So this is hard. This is hard when you have empowered teams who can make design decisions without asking people. My best answer is having these wandering coaches who go around all the teams and can see what they're doing at least. And having things like forums where what are they called? Communities of practice, these kinds of things. There's lots of stuff in this area. I don't have all the answers, but I think mob programming is a piece of the answer.
All right, maybe let's go for the last question because we're running out of time. Mob programming in practice, driver, navigator, and one other team member work on the problem, but others are inactive. What can we do with inactive members? Rotating the roles, just rotate the inactive role.
So the mob members are not inactive. They are actively listening to what's going on and making sure they follow. They can also interject coaching questions at any time if they feel that that would be helpful. So they're absolutely not just passive passengers in the mob. And as the mob becomes more mature and used to working in this way, then the mob members know when they should be stepping in and taking the navigator role or the driver role, and generally it becomes more of a collaboration between everyone who's in the mob.
All
It's
right.
a kind of maturity thing.
Thank you so much for your talk. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.